Hopefully you're seeing my presentation.
Not quite.
Not yet, you're on the other screen.
Yep, we've got your presentation mode.
Let's see, we'll try this again. Take two.
Better, much better. Thanks, Mark.
Cool, thank you, Tina. And thank you, Tina, and thank you, everyone, for taking the time to stay for this last session. I know when Dion was talking about COVID-19, some of those hazards associated with that. I think Zoom webinar fatigue is another hazard that we're all coping with over with COVID. So I thought I'd actually take the opportunity today to talk about some work that's ongoing in the ARC Centre, looking at, do we have a really good handle on horticulturally associated outbreaks in Australia? And are there still some gaps to fill? And so part of the impetus for this piece of work is that while we've actually, while we have actually reviewed a lot of these outbreaks, there's still some questions about other areas that we need to investigate. So I think many of you will have been to FPSC conferences or this conference before and heard plenty about some of the previous recent outbreaks. And certainly there's plenty of reviews out there. Most recently, Fazan's supporting document with regards to high-risk horticulture reviewed a lot of the recent outbreaks that have occurred in Australia. And so really, this is just a snapshot of perhaps the most high-profile ones and the ones that were identified in this supporting document. And really, I think none of these outbreaks are particularly surprising from the perspective as a food microbiologist. I think the learnings from these outbreaks, well, certainly the pathogens and the commodities associated with these outbreaks have sort of previously been identified and have consistently been something that horticulture and the fresh produce industry have always needed to be careful about. And so, you know, even going back to Codex's hygienic practice for fresh foods and the annexes back in 2000, you can see even then that they'd already identified as perhaps the 5 highest risk categories as fresh cuts, sprouts, leafy greens, melons, and berries. And if you sort of look at what was identified in the last couple of years, you'll see that really it's actually these same amount of, same categories of products. So I think really the thing about these outbreaks is these outbreaks were the multi-jurisdictional outbreaks, i.e., you know, these produce were transferred across borders, heavily investigated and quite large. So it was a case where these ones were the ones that were identified. And really, I think while it was actually quite important that we actually review these outbreaks, and we have reviewed these outbreaks before, a lot of the learnings were stuff that we actually probably already knew, and understanding that we really needed to be managing the impact of environmental conditions. So looking at making sure that extreme weather events, location of growing conditions, the growing conditions themselves was something that we needed to manage. Production input management, so whether it was irrigation water, as Channa talked about previously, or organic amendments, which Michelle briefly talked about in her presentation, or managing appropriate manufacturing practices in pack houses or processing facilities, understanding our agricultural process water requirements, and I guess with respect to the cases, the viral cases, understanding worker hygiene. And Dion really, I think, hammered home the point that, you know, with viral sort of things, it's actually about our workers. So really, when we actually look back at these outbreaks, and I'm not really going to go into these ones before, because I think we've actually gone into them quite a bit previously. I think the key point is that our processes are actually quite good in these spaces. It's just quite often we just need to make sure that we're actually following them fully. But where those outbreaks are interesting, I think there's another story there. And the question is, but do we have the full story? And so while those product pathogen combinations were actually considered quite high risk horticulture, what we are increasingly seeing are cases which previously, certainly previously were considered low risk horticulture. So Agam gave a great presentation on apples before, but recently, even this year, we've had issues with peaches. Not we, America has had issues with peaches. And similarly, also in the States, there's been cases of red onions associated with salmonellosis. So these categories are actually quite interesting because previously, we've not actually seen these cases. If there were cases associated with these product categories, we haven't actually necessarily seen them come out. The other category that sort of is less represented in these outbreaks are modified or value-added horticulture. And so previously those outbreaks have identified frozen product. And this is actually just from this year that over, this survey has found that a quarter of frozen vegetables in England were contaminated with listeria. And again, this is one of those challenging areas from a risk communication perspective, and certainly from my perspective, from my experiences in food microbiology, if someone tells me that there's some listeria in frozen vegetables, my comment is, well, they should be cooked. And that's certainly what the producer is putting on their packaging. But I guess there are changing approaches that people are using, ways that people are consuming their foods, and certainly it's an area that is certainly gaining traction. And so it's one of those areas that we need to actually be investigating as well. So those two areas, one of the comments that I'll often get is, well, we haven't seen these problems before. And I think this is actually a really tricky thing to explain. And whether we haven't seen them before, it doesn't mean they weren't necessarily there. So this is just a snapshot of previously, I think, how we were looking at outbreaks, and certainly how the size of an outbreak played out on whether we actually started looking at it and identifying it as a potential problem. So this was based on some FoodNet data from essentially the CDC in the past. And really what this study actually showed was that as your outbreak, if your outbreak was roughly 2 to 4 people, it was only a 20% chance that an analytical study was conducted. There was only about a 40% chance that you'd identify what the causative agent, and there was probably less than a 20% chance that we'd actually be able to identify what the vehicle or what produce was actually involved. And so really what we actually were seeing is, these smaller outbreaks and these underlying cases perhaps being underestimated. But what we actually have now is something like this. And certainly this is where our surveillance systems are moving towards, and certainly why perhaps underappreciated pathogen product combinations and certainly cases or potential vehicles for pathogens can probably no longer be ignored too much. And so this is just a case relating not actually to fresh produce, relating to smoked seafood in Europe. So this is actually a case, an outbreak associated with one processing facility between 2014 and 2019. So over 5 years, over 5 countries, there were essentially only 22 cases, and in many countries it was only 1 case. But yet over time, and certainly with our increased surveillance and the advent of whole genome sequencing, it's a case that this outbreak was identified and people have gone back to actually ask for improvements within this facility. And certainly we're seeing it in the States at the moment. Recent Colo 0157H7s, even announcements about outbreak alerts, and it's very responsive now to small potential outbreaks that advisories or certainly the regulators are actually responding quite quickly now. So with all that in mind, it's quite clear that even though we can pick these big outbreaks out, it's the question about these smaller burns or these longer outbreaks, smaller amount of people. Perhaps it's because that product isn't consumed that much. Perhaps it's the pathogen itself has got a low infectious dose. But I think we need to start looking at that. And so part of the question was, can we proactively identify these cases, and can we start to actually interrogate our outbreak or the data sets that are available to actually see if that's the case. So there's actually a whole lot of existing data that already exists with respect to essentially our understanding of what's going on out there. This is a conceptual model produced by Marvin et al, looking at big data in food safety, but sort of looking at, there's a variety of different sources that we can use to actually investigate and improve our food safety systems. And so one of those approaches is looking at outbreak databases. And so part of this work is working with collaborators to look in the AusFoodNet outbreak registry to actually see if we can actually investigate some of these outbreaks. But really one of the great questions, and again, coming back to the question of why haven't we seen these problems before, comes in part to the source attribution challenge. So I often use Caesar salad as a great example, because it's one of those products where if you see a case of salmonellosis in it, how can you actually really make a great call about what that source of that enteric pathogen is? Certainly, we have chickens have got a history, or certainly undercooked chickens are an issue. We see a lot of salmonellosis cases with eggs at the moment. Obviously, cos lettuce, if you're using cos, we've heard about romaine lettuce and the issues with that. And certainly from my experience, if using whole eggs to make your mayonnaise, that's definitely a no-go. So there's actually 4 high-risk ingredients in there. And even then, if you actually go down to some of the low-risk ingredients, you've got things like cheese or anchovies, which, while we wouldn't actually necessarily call them high-risk, are constituents that have previously been associated with foodborne illness. So part of what we're doing is going through some of these outbreaks and looking for categories that previously might have been excluded, but whether we can actually use some expert elicitation or different approaches to categorization to at least unpick that. In addition to that, I think it's important to acknowledge that there's a whole bunch of different databases and the different information that already exists out there. And what we're actually doing is trying to integrate some of that data to actually get a better handle of what's happening out there. So where to for this project and where is it going? As I mentioned, the aim is really to proactively build our capacity to respond to less established produce pathogen combinations. And what I mean by that is, I think it's very easy for us to perhaps give advice about, melons and sanitizers, but it's actually a lot more difficult to be able to give advice about things like frozen vegetables or certainly tree fruits, which have not previously been associated. Another part, and so part of that is by reviewing the AusFoodNet outbreak data with collaborators from ANU, Agri-Food Canada, and that's really being driven by Joe Rothwell. To further investigate opportunities to utilize whole genome sequencing data sets, and also to try and leverage some more data sets to inform on our risk assessments. I'd love to have more time to speak about it, so if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me via email, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Mark.